welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And today, Josh and I are going to be discussing the concept of mental or psychological flexibility. We're drawing some inspiration here from an article entitled The Blueprint for True Resilience by Kelly Oakes. And I found this through a newsletter that I subscribe to by Dr. Todd Kashdan called Provoked. We'll get to this a little bit later, but Todd comes from the positive psychology world, and some of what he has said in this article, he's also quoted in this article, comes from a book that he wrote some years ago with Robert Biswas-Diener called The Upside of Your Dark Side. And so, when we talk about being mentally flexible, maybe there is a little bit of embracing the dark side in a productive way. But the article begins really with a discussion about a particular definition, I think, like we were saying earlier, Josh, before we started to record, of mental toughness, and comparing and contrasting that to mental flexibility. So I was wondering if you could help us understand the difference between mental toughness and mental flexibility as portrayed in this article.
So it's interesting because mental toughness is something that I would say is thrown out a lot by coaches and parents and different sorts of people in the sports world. And, you got to be mentally tougher. You got to be, mental. It's all about mental toughness or things like that. You hear sports commentators say it, but I think it's not always as clear in terms of what that necessarily means. And I think it can mean different things to different people. And even within the academic literature, it can have different sorts of definitions. Back when I did my dissertation for my master's program, I did it on mental toughness in tennis and interviewed different college tennis coaches and talked to them about how they saw mental toughness or how they defined it. And it largely varied. And if you look, at the different literature, it ranges a lot. But in this article, they sort of describe it as this, as this ability to kind of put your head down and just get it done, whatever it is that you have to get done, right? So if I'm in a tennis match and there's some pain, okay, let's put my head down, let's kind of get it done. Or, in terms of my training or in terms of different sorts of things. And they contrast that, and Brian, feel free to add to sort of that, the way that they portray it. But I would say it's contrasted with this concept of mental flexibility, which they define as the willingness to match your behavior to whatever the situation demands, which I like. I like that idea. And again, I think, there are some definitions where that sort of flexibility or adjustability can be included in mental toughness as well. But I like the sort of conceptualization of mental flexibility as not just us, sort of putting our head down and figuring and doing the job regardless, but it's more about us being able to figure it out and find a way and be able to adapt to the situation in front of us.
I think the definition that they are using, it almost derives directly from the word toughness. It's almost like toughing it out.
Yep.
And putting everything aside and just taking on the pain and just going through it. And I think there's a story in there about a marathon runner who might push through pain and finish, but injures, himself or herself to the point where she can't continue. Will be out for a while. And from a tennis perspective, I think the idea of injury is a very interesting one for flexibility, because many of us will play through pain, whether that's in a match or over the course of several months, when perhaps we could have stopped and done the rehab, almost like our episode with Kerry Jackson, right? Turning rehab into your new sport, and then come back. and then not have a long time on the bench. I particularly um, can identify with this because Josh, I know I've driven myself to complete system breakdown in the past, and then been out for anywhere from 3 to 6 to 9 months because I didn't kind of have this flexible thing. And part of it was, oh, I'm playing so great. I don't want to stop.
Yep.
You feel like you're going to lose something if you stop. It's almost like a loss aversion piece. So, the idea of being able to consider your future a little bit more than what you're just doing in the moment, I think is a key component of this flexible mindset. Because let's even go back to our definition of what it means to be competitive. It's not about winning today. It's about a process of learning and improvement with the ultimate goal of becoming the best player that we can become. Does it make sense to tough it out in the moment and jeopardize that to a certain extent? Of course, we did an episode on pain and pain tolerance. There are going to be times where it's not going to jeopardize that. It's just like some pain you're dealing with in this match, and you can recover and ice and be fine in a few days. That's fine. But if it's something that's more serious, and the more you play, the worse it gets, and the worse it gets, then we want to have that more future-based mindset, knowing that this isn't about just today or this year. This is about my career. This is about this tennis project and me trying to become the best that I can become.
I think that long-term approach really, really makes it different. Yeah, it's really critical here because if we are putting too much focus and attention just on this one match that we're playing in, which I think is quite common for players in general, then we, in a lot of ways, we ignore that long-term goal of being the best player that we can be, right? If it's too much about winning today, then we're going to put our body at risk by trying to play through injuries, right? If it's all about winning today, then when we feel that an opponent cheats us, we might cheat them back because we need to win this match, right? And that feels like the most important thing in the world at that moment. Instead of thinking long term, okay, what type of player do I want to be and what type of person do I want to be? So I think by understanding that, who we want to be as a player and as a person, you know, is far more important than any one match. And though that match feels, it feels like the whole world in the moment, it really actually isn't generally as big as we're making it out to be, though it can feel that way. So I think by finding that perspective, it's easier to adopt this sort of attitude of mental flexibility because we can let go of that result for today, right? That doesn't mean we don't care. That doesn't mean it's not important. We obviously prefer to win, and we should try to do everything within the rules and within how we want to operate to try to win today, right? And to give our best effort, certainly. But if it feels bigger than it actually is, then it's gonna cause us to either cut corners or to over prioritize those wins of today with our future.
I think there's another in-match situation that we could look at, Josh, and I'll use an example from the pros, but this is also something I have done in my career. Let's go back to 2018 U.S. Open quarterfinal, Rafael Nadal versus Dominic Thiem. Rafa loses the first set 6-0. And in the press conference after the match, and for those who don't know, Rafa actually goes on to win this match in 5 sets. But he was asked about what was going on in the match, what adjustments was he making, etc. And so he just walked people through his thought process of the first set, and he said to himself at 4-0, just finish this set. Start fresh in the next one, and then look to make some changes. So what did he do there? without really saying it, he kind of just gave those last two games away, right? He just sort of threw those games away. And what's the perspective here? How's he being flexible? He's being flexible because he knows what he needs to win. Doesn't need to win every set, just needs to win three. And it's perfectly normal that somebody wins a set. And so, all right, just give this set away. I'm down 1-0, still in the match. And then he came back and won the next two sets before team came back and won this fourth, I think 7-6, and then it went 7-6 in the fifth, something like that. But a lot of people would say, oh, no, you should keep fighting. You just, work through it kind of thing. And this is an example of like, you know what? This is going to be a long match. You might need to conserve some energy here. So just let this set go and play on. And I've done this, I want to say like 3 or 4 times, Josh, where I've won the first set, down big in the second, and I just decide, you know what? Forget it. Let's play for the third. And in some of the more recent tournaments, you don't even have to win 2 sets. You have to win 1 set and a 10-point tiebreaker. That's actually a lot easier than winning 2 sets.
Yep.
So this has happened to me a couple of times, and I've never lost with this strategy. And to me, it's hard for me to necessarily advise players to do it without having a real conversation about why we're doing it. But for me, I can walk you through my process was like, all right, you know what? I want to have as much energy for the end of this match as possible. And me kind of wasting my time in a way, or energy, trying to get back into a set that I will most likely lose is only going to drain me. So let's just get through the set and we start fresh. And like I said, it has worked every single time that I have used that. But I think that is also an example, and the Rafa one is maybe a better one. It's an example of it being done at the elite level by somebody who knows what the long-term goal is here. The long-term goal is to win 3 sets.
Yep.
Not to win every game, not to have to win every set, and being flexible enough in your thinking that, yeah, you can let a couple of games go, knowing that I have a plan.
Exactly. No, it's because the end goal, similar to how, sort of as tennis players long term, the end goal is to be, the best player that we can be, right? The end goal in that match is to find a way to win. And again, that doesn't mean we are suggesting doing anything outside of the rules, but I think there are specific moments where you can be strategic like that, like Nadal showed, like you talked about as well, and how that can be helpful, right? I think sometimes, we want to, be able to adapt to that situation. We want to be creative in what that looks like, right? And I think, again, that contrasting between their definition of mental toughness in that situation would be, okay, I'm down 0-4 here. Let's put my head down. Let's try to find some sort of way to win this game. But by doing that, you might really tire yourself out. And then when you get to that third set, you get to that 10-point tiebreaker, you're toast because you're so exhausted at that point. So I think, I think this concept has a lot to do with being strategic and being thoughtful and not just pushing through at all costs, but being able to rethink your game plan in order to reach that goal, right? It's, the end goal is the same, but you're taking a different sort of approach and being flexible in that approach in order to reach that end goal that you have.
Yeah, exactly. So another compare contrast in the article, Josh, was about positive thinking versus mental flexibility and the notion of using, quote unquote, negative emotions in productive ways. And I'm really curious your thoughts on players or athletes doing that.
Yeah, so I like how they refer to your brain as sort of like a Swiss Army knife, where it has these different sorts of tools and options. And yeah, they talked about how you can use these negative emotions or harness them in order to, in order to really capitalize on the situation or maybe, take a better approach in the situation. So, for example, if, let's say your opponent made what you perceive to be a bad call or multiple bad calls against you, right? Easy for players to do a couple of things. Easy for players to maybe try to cheat back, and then as we've talked about that, just because they started it, then you're both cheating against each other. That makes both of you cheaters in that situation. Or maybe you tank and you have that as an excuse. Well, I lost this match because of that line call, and sort of putting aside the fact that you didn't give your best effort for the rest of that. But I think an alternative, a much better alternative, would be to harness those emotions of the moment, right? To harness the frustration that you have because of that line call, and maybe let that lead you to, really being more locked in that moment, right? More motivated, more focused, and use those emotions to try to drive you to find a way to win that match, right? Or I think another situation could be, when you don't have your best stuff on a particular day and you're not playing your best, you don't have your A game, or even your B game, you have your C game, let's say. And again, instead of letting that frustration overwhelm you, you're able to kind of harness that and shift into more problem solving. Okay, well, what can I do today? Well, I'm still hitting my forehand solidly enough. Okay, can I run around my backhand more? Can I make sure I'm on my toes more? Can I attack my opponent's weakness more? Okay, if I don't have my best game, can I try to at least keep it together mentally in a solid way so that I'm not beating myself in that way? Right. So I think in both of those situations, we can harness sort of the frustration of that moment and turn it into something more productive, whether that's motivation, whether that's problem solving and sort of being in that sort of problem solving state of mind. And I think we can do the same with other sorts of more challenging emotions as well.
So what you're describing there is something that John Newcomb and who's very famous Australian tennis player, Grand Slam champion, and Davis Cup captain for Australia, and Michael Duff, who's an executive coach, in their book, The Power Within, they call this dissatisfaction, as being dissatisfied with what's happening and then channeling it. I like this idea of making us think about positive thinking versus mental flexibility. Certainly, optimism and positive thoughts are helpful. We're not saying that they're not. But there might be times, like in the situations you're describing, Josh, and this is where Todd Kashdan is quoted, in which we could harness something that might be perceived normally as a negative emotion and use the energy of that to produce something positive. And when Todd and Robert Biswas-Diener wrote the book, The Upside of Your Dark Side, it was maybe, I want to say like 2008, 2009. It was a while ago. And I think it was trying to address the fact that positive psychology at the time was just a little too positive. It wasn't really embracing the whole person and the whole emotional experience. And so I think they wanted to bring attention to that. And after I read the book, I liked how they did this. And so I came up with a graphic that I would show players. And basically what it had was, like a negative emotion, and then the direction that you would channel it into. So let's say it is anger or frustration, Josh. Well, you could channel that backwards and be upset with yourself, beat yourself up, no self-compassion whatsoever, whining, excuses, right? And then there's no real direction other than just attacking yourself. Or, and this is the harder part, but we've both had athletes who can do this, or know people who can do this, who take whatever just happened and use that as fuel for the fire. And now they use that energy and they channel it forward into action.
Yep.
And hopefully, as you were saying too, action that is compatible with our virtues and values of the person that we want to be, right? So not cheating back, but yeah, you're getting cheated. It could be like, you know what? You just cheated the wrong guy. Let's go. I am so going to kill you now, right? So
Yep.
you're using that sort of dissatisfaction. Maybe they have violated one of your values. Maybe one of your values is fairness or, honesty, integrity. And you're not happy about that. You're dissatisfied with what's going on here. Let's channel that into energy, drive, motivation, figuring it out. Um, so we just want to recognize that that's possible. Again, not everybody necessarily can use that. A lot of people get stuck in criticizing themselves, seeing too much of their own, needing to validate themselves through tennis and winning and playing well. So this might be harder for that person, but this is also a good thing to keep in mind. Like, all right, could I try that? Could I look at what's happening on the court and try to energize myself into action, into recognizing my own values as a person, and then seeing what's happening?
Yep.
Because in the end, I think that will make the player proud and personally satisfied with at least what they did. Where if we're just whining and complaining and beating ourselves up, like you said earlier, just making excuses, now you're just protecting your self-esteem, but are you really proud of that effort in the end?
No, I think that's absolutely true. And I think we can all probably think back to certain moments where we encountered a challenging moment like that, and maybe we didn't handle it in the best way. But I think it's yeah, if we are able to be really clear about those values and virtues and the type of person that we strive to be, then it's easier in that moment to to try to handle it in the way that we really want to and need to in that moment. So I think I think it takes some work ahead of time so that we're prepared for that moment, right? I think we want to put in that work, but also be able to be realistic with the types of situations that we might find ourselves in on that particular day, right? And that situation might be that we, that our opponent is making line calls that we disagree with, or that situation might be that that we don't have our best game, or that it's extremely windy and that's impacting all of our shots, or or that it's super hot, or whatever it is. But I think if we can both be really clear about our values and who we are and who we want to be, but also be able to almost like plan out our response to different situations that may arise, then then I think it makes it a lot easier to actually handle those moments better when they do come up.
So part of developing mental, psychological flexibility is a little bit of understanding about acceptance, commitment therapy, which we have talked about in some episodes. Um, and here it's really accepting how you're feeling, accepting maybe even what you're thinking, rather than fighting it. When we fight it, now we're creating some sort of battle here that we don't really need to create. We've already got a battle going on the court. So if you're noticing you're feeling nervous, that's okay. Hey, I'm feeling nervous. Or I'm feeling upset. It's just sort of accepting that, and when we accept it, it tends to take the power away from the emotion. And then the commitment part is like what we've been talking about a little bit here, is understanding, what are our own virtues and values. And that's a good exercise for everybody to go through, is to figure out what are the important virtues and values to you. Maybe acceptance is actually one of them. Or it could be courage or fairness, integrity, respect. A lot of different things, but you'll have your own ones that are unique to you. And then it's acting in accordance with your virtues and values in that situation. So by understanding our own brains a little bit better, we can also work with who we are. And I really like this part of what the authors, or Todd Kashdan is quoted in here. So is Dr. Josie Perry, and this notion of really accepting who you are versus always trying to fix who you are or being dissatisfied. And so many of us are talented or have strengths in very unique ways, yet we tend to take them for granted and we work on other parts of ourselves.
Yep.
And a lot of, I think, ACT is, no, you're an amazing, unique person. Going back to your Swiss Army knife thing, right? So we've got some real strengths here. How can we leverage those more in this situation? That's good. That's flexibility. That's also developing a good relationship with yourself, which is obviously a very positive thing. You don't want to be spending 80% of your attention on the 20% of yourself you don't like.
Right.
Right. And the same goes for relationships with people. You don't want to be spending 80% of your energy focusing on the 20% of a person that you don't like when you really like 80% of them. So I think this idea of really accepting yourself and leveraging your own strengths in these situations where you need flexibility, rather than lamenting the fact that, oh, I can't do this, I can't do that. Let's think a little bit more about what we can do and the kind of person that we want to continue to be through this process.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point in terms of being able to accept, our whole person, right? Being able to accept our, our strengths as a person, and being able to accept certain things about us that maybe we're always trying to change or view as weaknesses or deficiencies in some ways. I think actually in certain ways this relates to a topic that we've discussed in the past of being able to take more of a strengths-based approach, where instead of constantly defining ourselves based on, those deficiencies, or, oh, I have a weak backhand and that's holding me back from where I want to be, and sort of seeing ourselves in that light. Yes, we can spend time trying to work on those weaknesses, but we want to really focus on our strengths and define ourselves through our strengths, and and also practice our strengths, try to make those strengths better and better, make them sort of super strengths. And I think that acceptance has a lot to do with that. I think if we can accept all of ourselves, then we can, instead of fixating too much on our perceived weaknesses, it's easier to to keep those weaknesses in perspective, but not let those define us, and choose to focus a little bit more on some of our strengths and continue building up those strengths so that they can really define our game even more, and really be I guess hallmark characteristics of our tennis.
Yeah. So I think when we look at flexibility, the opposite of that is rigidity, is maybe getting stuck in specific responses to different situations. And one way to begin to develop the awareness of how you're thinking is something we've mentioned many times, is mindfulness or meditation, being able to observe and know how your brain works. And it also provides an opportunity to bring your focus to the present, but also to be self-compassionate. When your mind wanders, how do you want to really address that? There's no, like I like to tell tennis players, there is literally no meditation world championship. We're not competing here. It's impossible to empty your mind. And in fact, the people who report the most mind wandering are actually like Buddhist monks. Now you would say, well, wait, they should be the most focused. No, they're the most attuned to the fact their mind has wandered, right? So we want to, in a way, use something like that to help us be more flexible and understand how our own brains work. Um, I do want to say something about the whole positive thinking, Josh, because we are talking about being flexible here.
Mhm.
And this discussion is reminding me of another theory from positive psychology called broaden and build. So this is from Barbara Fredrickson in her book on positivity, and that how when we have more positive emotions, ratio of maybe 3 or more to 1, it keeps our minds more flexible. We have more options. We tend to be more creative. We're more responsible for dealing with our own mistakes. Now, there's never zero negative emotions, right? So the ratio that she talks about is anywhere between 3 positive emotions to, say, 10, or you're kind of border, maybe 8. Anything above 8 to 1, you're starting to enter la la land and being very naive about how the world works. But want to make sure that we're keeping, even if we engage a negative emotion, engage perhaps our dark side a little bit. We don't want that ratio to change substantially, because when we become overly negative, we narrow down our options to very
Yep.
few things. So I want to make sure that we're not saying, hey, forget about positive thinking, just go to your dark side and let that run the show. That most likely will not work when you get into a difficult match in which you need to be making good decisions. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
I mean, I think that I think having um, a degree of optimism can certainly be helpful. And I think again, if we're comparing it to that sort of Swiss Army knife, having that in your toolkit can be really key. And then also having the ability to harness negative emotions can be really key. And having the ability to problem solve and make changes, and be flexible in this way, which I think is sort of the overarching concept that we're talking about is essential. So I think it is one piece to the puzzle, but it's almost as if we're all we have is a hammer, right? If all that we have is optimism, then all we have is a hammer, and we're trying to use that on whatever it is. Okay, well there's a nail. Okay, perfect. Well, I can use that. But then there's a screw. Okay, and I'm going to still try to use my hammer on that screw, and that's not going to work. But if I have the flexibility and adaptability of, let's say a Swiss Army knife or a whole toolkit of tools, then I can handle whatever sorts of challenges are I'm facing, right? I'm not limited by just taking one approach. I have options. And it can take time. I think it can take time to get to that point of of feeling like you have options. I think there's trial and error that is required, right? Someone's first tennis match, they are, you don't feel equipped necessarily to handle all those different things that can and will happen in a match, right? But over time and learning from mistakes and, you know, figuring out what how you want to be operating, you can start to build those different tools or those different options, and then when you encounter them, you can try to match the right tool or the right skill with the situation, which to me is what this is all about. But I think it takes time to sort of build up to that point.
Yeah. And what do you think about making that an explicit part of your tennis project? The development of
Absolutely.
those tools, the development of, wisdom, self-mastery in this process. Because I think we all, like you said, we start with very little experience. We're doing the best we can with what we have, but we don't have a lot of options. And so if we can be looking at our competitive experiences as, yeah, I just added another tool to my Swiss Army knife or to my toolbox, I know how to deal with this situation now, right? And be explicit about
Yep.
that, especially even if you're a coach or a sports psych professional. Be explicit with, yeah, we're trying to build these specific tools. Why? Because it's building your tennis IQ, and you'll be able to handle almost anything that comes at you. Of course, there will always be a new obstacle, and then we can talk about it. All right, what's the tool for that? But we're constantly looking to learn and acquire new tools where we can. And we'll have some tools that we'll be able to use in a lot of different areas, but there might be some nuanced ones. So I really like that, Josh, what you just said. And I think we could just be more explicit about how we are looking at it and trying to develop that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, the way that I will often frame sports psychology overall, and I think there's sort of different pieces to it, but I think one of the big pieces is that mental toolkit. Being able to help athletes and tennis players develop that sort of mental toolkit of some of these different tools like self-talk and routines and visualization and the ability to set different types of goals and prepare for matches and things like that. And also, I'll sort of differentiate that from some of those bigger picture concepts of confidence and motivation, resilience. But yeah, I think that ability to have that toolkit, or sort of that Swiss Army knife, or however we want to conceptualize it, can really lead to a lot of confidence, because it doesn't just mean that okay, this is my game and I have to win this certain way because that's my only way to play and that's my only way to win. It's the adaptability and flexibility that I have options. I can win in this particular way. I can win by serving and volleying, or I can win by counterpunching. I can win by running around as many backhands as I can and letting my forehand dominate and try to be my main weapon out there. Or I can slice and dice and play more cat and mouse tennis, right? So that's more in terms of the strategic side, but also mentally, right? Understanding, okay, I can use my optimism, or I can use sort of that ability to harness the negative and the challenging emotions. And I think, yeah, that those having, having those options, I think leads to a lot of confidence where it's, that you can problem solve and handle whatever situations you find yourself in, rather than, than sort of an insistence on doing it a certain way. It's I think a greater sense of confidence that you can respond to whatever life and whatever the match throws at you.
So obviously it's key that we try to develop mental flexibility in our lives, but also through the sport of tennis. It can help so many different things. And as we mentioned earlier, this was contrasted with a particular view of mental toughness. Other views of mental toughness actually include this mental flexibility as a part of that. So we want to be conscious of that there are other ways to define mental toughness or mental strength, and the relationship of flexibility is maybe outside it sometimes, maybe it's inside it. I don't know that it's neither here nor there, but I think this is a good conversation to have about what it really means. Do you have last thoughts?
Not really. But I think, I would encourage people to look back to, maybe some of your better matches, right? And understand, okay, did I win that because I was just on fire the whole time? And, maybe, or, I think for a lot of people, it's tough to be on fire for an entire 3-set match or 2-set match or whatever it may be. Or was I successful because I found a way? Because I was able to adapt, because I was able to be resilient, because I was able to handle those challenges in front of me and maybe be flexible and maybe make adjustments in that moment. And I think, when I look back to some of my best matches, it was more that, right? Yes, I felt like I was playing well, but I also felt like I was able to adjust to those situations that were thrown at me, rather than putting my head down and insisting that I was going to go about it a certain way.
Well, that's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for the two of us, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube. And you can also check us out on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.